Hi everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Peter Wittig, co-founder at Motive.io. We are a VR solutions provider and we make a platform for enterprise VR training. We're based in Vancouver, Canada. Thanks for joining from wherever you are in the world. So this talk is based on work my company has done, conversations I've had with many other companies who have done pilots in large organizations, and other VR solution providers. So here we go. Future-proofing your VR training pilot project. So why is this topic important? Firstly, VR is great for training, and I'm not here to convince you of that. You can find lots of studies online saying this is the case. I put a link to a guide on our site if you want to grab it later. But most companies don't get past the pilot. And so I want to share some strategies for a couple of things. Firstly, creating a successful pilot, how to prepare for the pilot's success, and then finally laying the groundwork to build upon that success. This talk is applicable to a wide range of industries. There are companies in all of these industries that use VR training. These are a few examples, there are certainly more. So this talk is applicable to several types of training as well. The topics we're going to cover are generally applicable over industries and different training types. Here's what we'll cover. If your pilot gets these things right, you'll have a much greater chance of expanding your VR initiative. Let's jump in. Showing ROI is the most important metric for determining the success of your VR pilot. Any VR pilot worth investing in will track learner outcomes. That's a given. Having that data will allow you to improve your VR training as you move forward. However, organizations often do not have comparable metrics for their current training process. So we need to help them generate those. How do we do that? We need to answer some questions about the current training process. Then we'll identify the potential improvement we want to measure when using your VR pilot. So let's consider those two things as we look at good candidate procedures within your organization. Most VR pilot projects focus on one specific procedure. Therefore, choosing the right procedure is paramount. Identify a procedure where learning outcomes will have an immediate and measurable impact. The immediacy will help keep the momentum going. Measurable will help you prove ROI. So we want something that happens often. The more procedure happens, the bigger the value. Also, people will get more used to the idea of using VR training while the pilot is happening. We want it to be relevant to many people. So possibly other departments who are doing something similar will see the VR pilot and think to themselves, this could be applicable for me and my team. Safety training is a good example of this. Again, helps build a buzz internally. Multiple steps. So we want a procedure that is sufficiently complex so it can demonstrate the learning value versus the current way of training. If it's too easy, it's not going to be taken seriously. Here are some common indicators to help you find the right procedure within your organization for your pilot. These are just guidelines. There are certainly others. So if you have one in mind, certainly consider it. Let's take a look at each of these. Long training time. This is a process that sees learners needing to redo training several times before they can complete a task. It may take learners days or weeks of training before they can consistently do their job. Perhaps this is new employee training. If this type of training happens often and there is a desire for a faster process, then this is a good candidate for your VR pilot. Now there are questions you can ask of the current process that really focus around how long does an employee take to train before they can perform the task? How often do they need to repeat that training? Are there any external resources that need to be brought in to facilitate the training? And do they damage any products as a result of the training? So if you know that, you can measure with your pilot, are they training faster? Do they need repeat training? And if so, is it less? Do they need external resources to come in because they've got the headset? And they certainly won't lose or damage any real products because they'll all be virtual. Training lag. There's a lag between when training happens and when employees perform the task for which they have been trained. This can happen when instructors are needed for live training and are only available at certain times. This often means employees need to be retrained and instructors need to be available again for that to happen. This is costly and causes a delay between when the job needs to get done and when it actually does. So if your VR pilot can allow for trainees to get the training they need on demand, this is a good choice. Current process questions. How often do employees need to be retrained due to this type of lag? How much do each of those sessions cost? Are there delays between when a job needs to be done and getting employees retrained? If so, how long? What's the financial impact of those delays? Some things that you can measure. On-demand VR training will remove those delays. On-demand training removes the need for external resources. Requests for help training. New employees often ask more experienced employees to help them performing a task which is new to them. Every time this happens, this means two employees aren't as productive as they could be. Taking a skilled employee away from their work reduces productivity overall. The less a new employee needs to do this, the more productivity will increase. If your VR pilot can help new employees get the skills they need without interrupting more experienced employees, this should be an option. So current process. How often does an experienced worker stop working to help a new worker? How many hours a day does this happen? How often does a new worker request help from a more experienced worker? On what procedures is this most common? And which of those has the highest impact on productivity? Things you can measure. Reduce or eliminate requests for help with on-demand VR training. Provide easy access to on-demand VR training on a per-step basis. So if an employee has an issue with step 6 in a process, make it easy for them to jump right to step 6 in the VR training. This should increase productivity overall. Travel for training. I know this isn't happening a lot now, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But people who are being flown somewhere for training, it's a very costly measure. So this happens when a facility has been built for certain types of training, for a training conference, or if a trainer needs to go from location to location to do their job. All are expensive. The many costs of flights, hotels, food, cars, instructors, and facilities can quickly add up. So your VR pilot can remove this need for travel. You should consider choosing it for your pilot. Current process questions all center around costs of employee travel, how often an employee is traveling, and how many employees are traveling for training. So again, if VR can eliminate these travel costs and give extra time back to the employees, that's a big win. This one's a bit different. This is when the old way no longer works. I call it the gap. I see this happening more and more. You have a process that can't work any longer, but you still need to train people. That's not optional. So there's two choices. You can retreat or move forward. Thankfully, I've been seeing a lot of companies choose to move forward. So examples of this happening, training, which I was talking about a second ago, in the current climate, companies are spending millions of dollars to replace this type of training with VR. It'll be interesting to see who goes down this path and how many return to doing it the old way once things go back to normal. My guess is some will, but not many. Procedures, which depend on new workers shadowing more experienced workers, is another example. So experienced workers are retiring in some of these industries, and there will soon not be enough experienced workers for new people to shadow. So those procedures need to be completely redone. A final example I'll give you is training at a manufacturing company was dependent upon prototypes built by a design team. So the design team is now moving to digital prototypes. So this means there's no longer physical prototypes on which to train people. So they have to find a new way. Again, the ROI prop is different for these, but it's easier because you're not battling against a current procedure. The current procedure is gone and must be replaced. At this point, I want to pause. So we should have a decent idea of what we're looking at for a procedure in a VR pilot. We're going to have a candidate procedure. We're going to have a plan to measure specific outcomes in the current procedure and in the VR pilot. That's going to help us form a way to show ROI. Now we just need a plan to build it. The scene in which the procedure takes place needs to be recreated as a 3D environment. You might hire a VR provider for this, or you may have people internally who build it for you. Make note of the following. This will help you get your scene built more quickly. Where does it take place? Is it a warehouse, a factory, a hospital, office, construction site, something like that? What objects do I need to perform the procedure? Tools, equipment, monitors, another person, control boards, a vehicle, etc. How will a trainee interact with those objects to perform the procedure? Will they pick things up, pull levers, push buttons, move things from one place to another, move themselves, talk to a person, operate machinery? What are they going to do with the objects in the scene? And one final note to keep in the back of your head. Make note of any other procedures that will happen in the same scene. These can be reused and will help you deliver quickly on the next project after the pilot. There are many roles that are important for the success of your pilot. Managers, SMEs, 3D artists, many more. I want to focus on how your choice of development process for building your VR pilot affects these two job roles in particular, training and learning professionals and developers. The relationship between these two job roles will not only help the success of your pilot, but will prepare you for success after the pilot. As far as I've seen, there are 3 ways you can produce a VR pilot. Here they are. 2 of which have tools which training professionals can use. Now, the first process is the one that the vast majority of VR pilots get produced using. This is where the developers are doing everything, the training professionals are giving them documents, and the developers are creating those procedures inside of the code or in the 3D engine. The second one is intended to bring the training professional into Unity with a series of plugins and UIs and some other features. The third is more familiar, in my opinion, to training tools training professionals use. It's a web-based drag and drop authoring tool that knows how to connect with Unity. And full disclosure, this is a solution that my company provides. This is the process you should expect with no tools. So you start the project, and the trainers have produced a series of documents, emails, meeting notes, spreadsheets, videos, which detail the training procedures and any updates on those procedures. And they give those to the developers. The developers code and create that content. So while that's happening, the trainers are waiting. So the developers have finished coding it, and they create a build, and they put that on VR headsets and give it to the trainers. The trainers can then test to see if those procedures have been implemented correctly. And while that's happening, the developers are waiting. Now, you're going to go through several of these cycles. A cycle usually takes a few weeks. As you go through more, that time gets shorter, but you should expect to go through several of these. And then eventually, you're going to get your pilot. Now, you might ask, why are they doing it this way? For a bit of history, this is a very normal, and I would say a good process when no tools are available. Showing my age a bit, I remember when the web was new enough where companies were finally deciding they might need a website. Well, when that happened, this was the same process. The tech was new, and there weren't tools to create websites like there are now. And so the content people were bottlenecked by the developers. And you can set up business processes to make this work well. And when you don't have tools, it's a good way to do it. Another example I can think of is when video was difficult to get on the web. The only way to get video on the web was call a developer. We all know that that's changed, and the result of those content creators getting tools has resulted in billions and billions of dollars in the web and in many other spaces. So why aren't we using tools to produce VR training? Well, some people are. Let's explore that. So one of the approaches to tools is to make it easier for training professionals to use the same tools that the developers are using, Unity or Unreal. Now, I've seen a handful of companies produce editors inside of Unity that make it easier with UIs or catalogs than it would be otherwise of learning Unity on its own. That comes with its own costs, and some of those are listed here. But in general, I would say that this is a better way of doing it than the previous way. As there are different solutions by different companies, there's a variability to what applies to which of those, and I'm not going to explore those too deeply, but I will move on to the next one, and I wanted to let you know that those exist. Use tools in this process is to use a drag and drop web-based authoring tool. What this does is it lets the developer make the VR Unity project, and it gives the training professional the ability to create and modify training procedures in the web tool. Both of those feed into VR headsets. So as the developer makes new builds or improvements to the Unity project, those can be uploaded to the VR headset. Trainers can put on that headset at any point, and all the changes from the web authoring tool are automatically downloaded and available. So the Unity SDK that the developers put onto the headset in the VR training app knows how to communicate with the authoring tool and can grab any changes automatically. So this provides a familiar interface for training professionals. It lets both groups work in parallel. It lets you update the training app and automatically receive those updates. And this is a really important point. Let's say you sent headsets out to 10 different locations in your organization, and you wanted to change something in the procedure. Well, let's look at how you could do that with no tools versus this web authoring tool. So in the harder case, when you have no tools, this is the process for changing a procedure. And this is true whether it's happening during the development of your VR pilot or if it's a change to a procedure that it's on deployed headsets throughout your organization, perhaps in multiple locations. Let's take a look. It'll look very familiar to the slide a few ago about the no tools process. So it's that same cycle, producing documents, talking to a dev, verifying that it worked, and then eventually deploying it, creating a build and deploying it. Or, in the case of using the web authoring tool, you could do it the easier way. Simply log in, make the change, click save, and the next time it boots up in all those locations, it will automatically grab the change. Here's a process comparison for training professionals of those approaches. Now keep in mind that the vast majority of VR pilots are produced using the no tools approach. Now think about how you're going to succeed after the pilot using the no tools approach. It'll take longer, and it'll be more expensive. If you use tools of one variety or another, I think you're going to have an easier time of making the case of moving forward with your VR initiative within your organization. So let's recap. So if you're planning to expand your pilot, making the right choice of the process you're going to use and choosing whether or not to use tools will make it far easier moving forward to expand your pilot and your VR initiative internally. Choosing the right procedure, one that will have an immediate and measurable impact, will help sell it internally and help you show ROI for that pilot. Keeping in mind the scene you're using and the other procedures that you can use in that scene are going to set you up for your next success right after the pilot. Then finally, and I wish I had more time to talk about this, but have a plan to integrate with your company LMS or LRS systems and other learning systems that you've got at your company. Being able to integrate with what you already have will make it easier for you to sell it inside. Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to hear my talk. My contact info is here. Please reach out if you have any questions. I'm also in the chat, so please feel free to ask me any questions there. I look forward to continuing the conversation, and I hope you have a great rest of your conference. Bye-bye.